The airfield was too quiet. On the cold afternoon of the 15th of January 1945, a lone German fighter touched down on a snow-dusted runway. The engine of the aging Messerschmitt Bf 109 coughed once before falling silent. For most pilots, the mission had been routine. Another patrol. Another search for American bombers over a shrinking German sky. But the man climbing out of the cockpit was no ordinary pilot. Erich Hartmann was already a legend among fighter pilots. With hundreds of confirmed victories, his instincts in the air had become almost supernatural. He had survived dogfights that killed men far more cautious than he was. In the brutal skies of the Eastern Front and over Germany itself, Hartmann had proven something few believed possible, that skill, discipline, and perfect timing could allow a single pilot to defeat enemy formations many times his size. Yet as Hartmann walked across the frozen tarmac toward the operations building, something felt wrong. The revetments that once protected dozens of fighters were empty. Ground crews sat silently in the winter wind. And within minutes, Hartmann would learn the truth. In just 7 days, the German Luftwaffe had lost nearly 5,000 aircraft. Not damaged, not grounded, destroyed. In that moment, one of the greatest fighter pilots in history realized something terrifying. The war in the air was no longer about skill. It had become a war of mathematics. Long before the winter of 1945, the German Luftwaffe had been one of the most feared air forces in the world. In the early years of the war, its fighters dominated the skies of Europe. German aircraft were fast, heavily armed, and flown by pilots trained under one of the most rigorous aviation systems ever created. Young recruits spent months mastering formation, flying, navigation, and aerial combat before ever seeing the front lines. By the time they entered combat, many had already accumulated more flight hours than pilots from most other nations. At the center of this system stood aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109. First designed in the mid-1930s, it became the backbone of Germany's fighter fleet throughout the war. The aircraft was compact, powerful, and deadly in experienced hands. Armed with cannons capable of tearing through enemy aircraft in seconds, the Bf 109 allowed skilled pilots to strike quickly and disappear before their opponents could react. Few pilots demonstrated this mastery better than Erich Hartmann. By 1945, Hartmann had already built a reputation that bordered on myth. Fellow pilots described his ability to read aerial combat like a chess match unfolding at hundreds of miles per hour. He rarely fired more than a short burst of ammunition before breaking away. Precision, patience, and discipline defined his approach. Over time, these tactics would give him more aerial victories than any fighter pilot in history. But while Hartmann and other veterans were achieving extraordinary results in the sky, the war itself was quietly changing. The conflict that began with lightning offensives and daring air battles was evolving into something much larger. World War II was becoming a war of factories, supply chains, and industrial capacity. Nations were no longer simply fighting with armies and aircraft. They were fighting with entire economies. And in that arena, Germany was beginning to fall behind. German factories could produce roughly 1,000 fighter aircraft per month under ideal conditions. That might have been enough earlier in the war. But by 1944, Germany was no longer fighting a single opponent. Across the Atlantic, American factories were operating at a scale the world had never seen. Production lines ran day and night, turning out aircraft at staggering speeds. While German factories struggled under constant bombing, American industry was producing thousands of aircraft every month. The difference was not merely technological, it was mathematical. For every German fighter lost, several new Allied aircraft could take its place. New pilots arrived continuously from training schools that were expanding faster than Germany could destroy them. Fuel supplies, spare parts, and replacement engines flowed through a vast industrial system that stretched across an entire continent. Meanwhile, German pilots were beginning to notice something unsettling. Each month, there were fewer aircraft returning to base, and fewer pilots arriving to replace the ones who never came back. By the winter of 1944, Germany's military leadership believed it still had one final opportunity to change the course of the war. Adolf Hitler called it a decisive gamble. The plan was bold, dangerous, and desperate. German forces would launch a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. If successful, the attack would split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiations. This operation would later become known as the Battle of the Bulge. For the Luftwaffe, the mission was clear. German fighters would provide air cover for the advancing ground forces and disrupt Allied air operations long enough for the offensive to succeed. For the first time in years, large formations of German aircraft were assembled for a single campaign. Pilots like Erich Hartmann saw something they had not witnessed in a long time: mass formations of German fighters rising into the winter sky. On some days, 200 or even 300 aircraft launched from different bases to support the offensive. The airfields buzzed with activity. Mechanics worked through the night, repairing damaged engines and patching bullet holes in aircraft that had barely survived their previous missions. For a brief moment, it felt like the Luftwaffe had returned. But the illusion did not last long. Across the English Channel and newly captured airfields in France and Belgium, Allied air power was gathering on a scale Germany could barely comprehend. The United States Army Air Forces had deployed thousands of fighters and bombers across Western Europe. Aircraft such as the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt escorted bomber formations deep into German territory. These fighters had something German pilots increasingly lacked: range, fuel, and overwhelming numbers. When German fighters appeared in the skies during the Ardennes campaign, American controllers responded immediately. Radar stations tracked the movements of German aircraft and directed Allied fighters to intercept them. The result was a series of massive aerial battles over Western Europe. German pilots reported encountering formations of 50, 80, sometimes more than 100 American fighters. Aircraft designed to fight in small tactical groups suddenly found themselves facing swarms of enemy planes filling the sky in every direction. Even for experienced pilots, the situation was overwhelming. The losses began to mount quickly. Aircraft were shot down faster than German factories could replace them. Damaged fighters returned to bases that lacked spare parts or replacement engines. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons for days at a time. Within a single week of intense combat, the numbers became catastrophic. Thousands of German aircraft had been destroyed. What had been intended as Germany's final offensive in the West was quietly becoming something else entirely. It was turning into the moment when the Luftwaffe began to collapse under the weight of a war it could no longer sustain. On the 15th of January 1945, the reality finally became impossible to ignore. Erich Hartmann guided his Messerschmitt Bf 109 onto the runway of his base after a long patrol over Germany. The mission itself had been uneventful. No bombers had appeared, no enemy fighters had crossed his path. It should have been just another routine landing in a war that had already lasted more than 5 years. But the moment his aircraft rolled to a stop, Hartmann sensed that something had changed. The airfield felt wrong. Normally, dozens of fighters would be parked along the reinforced revetments that protected them from bombing raids. Ground crews would be moving between aircraft, refueling tanks, loading ammunition belts, and preparing the next wave of sorties. That afternoon, most of the revetments were empty. Hartmann counted barely a dozen aircraft on the entire field. The silence was unsettling. When he entered the operations building, the explanation was waiting for him. A large status board on the wall listed the number of operational fighters assigned to the base. Before the Ardennes campaign, the same board had reported nearly 50 aircraft ready for combat. Now the number had fallen to 15. The losses were staggering. Across the entire Luftwaffe, reports indicated that between 4,000 and 5,000 German aircraft had been destroyed in just 7 days of combat operations. These were not aircraft awaiting repair. These were total losses, burned wreckage scattered across the forests and fields of Western Europe. Yet the destruction of machines was only part of the disaster. Every aircraft represented a trained pilot, and trained pilots were far harder to replace than airplanes. Germany's pilot training system had been designed for a long war, but not for the scale of losses now occurring. Flight schools lacked instructors, training aircraft, and most critically, fuel. New pilots were graduating with barely 50 hours of flight experience, a fraction of what earlier generations had received. Many had never even fired the guns of a fighter aircraft before entering combat. For veterans like Hartmann, the consequences were painfully clear. The experienced squadron leaders who had fought since the early years of the war were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. Young pilots arrived at the front lines frightened, inexperienced, and completely unprepared for the brutal realities of aerial combat. One of those young pilots was a 19-year-old trainee named Friedrich. Hartmann attempted to help him during a brief training flight, demonstrating the basics of positioning and energy management in the air. But the lessons were rushed and incomplete. Fuel shortages allowed barely 40 minutes in the air at a time. It was nowhere near enough. 2 days later, Friedrich was sent on his first combat patrol. He encountered a single American P-51 Mustang. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. Friedrich's aircraft caught fire and crashed before he had the chance to escape. For Hartmann, the tragedy was heartbreaking but not surprising. By that point, the outcome had already been decided. The Luftwaffe was no longer losing individual battles. It was losing the ability to exist as an air force at all. By early 1945, the air war over Europe had transformed into something fundamentally different from the dramatic dogfights that had defined its early years. What had once been a contest of maneuver, tactics, and individual skill was now a contest of industrial strength. For the United States and its allies, air power was supported by an enormous economic engine that stretched across entire continents. American factories operated around the clock, producing aircraft, engines, spare parts, and ammunition at a pace no other nation could match. The numbers were staggering. While Germany struggled to produce roughly 1,000 fighter aircraft per month under constant Allied bombing, American industry was producing several times that number. Assembly lines in cities like Detroit and Los Angeles turned out aircraft in a steady flow that never seemed to slow. Equally important was the training system behind those machines. American pilot training schools operated on a scale that Germany could not replicate by the final years of the war. Thousands of new pilots graduated each month, many of them with hundreds of flight hours before ever entering combat. By the time a pilot was assigned to a fighter squadron in Europe, he had already spent months mastering navigation, formation flying, gunnery, and aerial tactics. In contrast, the German training pipeline was collapsing. Fuel shortages, destroyed airfields, and the loss of experienced instructors forced training programs to shorten dramatically. By 1945, some German pilots arrived at operational squadrons with fewer than 60 hours of flight time. Many had never practiced live aerial combat. The difference in experience was often fatal. When an inexperienced pilot encountered a veteran American fighter pilot flying an aircraft like the P-51 Mustang, the outcome was frequently decided within moments. Combat experience, superior numbers, and reliable logistics gave Allied air forces a decisive advantage in nearly every engagement. This imbalance extended far beyond individual dogfights. The Allied strategy of strategic bombing targeted Germany's oil refineries, transportation networks, and aircraft factories. Each successful raid weakened the German ability to repair aircraft, transport supplies, or train new pilots. Slowly but relentlessly, the system that supported the Luftwaffe was being dismantled. By the time pilots like Erich Hartmann realized the full scale of the crisis, the damage had already spread across every part of Germany's war machine. The air war was no longer being decided in the skies above Europe. It was being decided in factories, fuel depots, and production lines thousands of miles away. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the skies above Germany had grown strangely quiet. Many of the great air bases that once launched hundreds of fighters now stood abandoned. Runways were cracked, hangars burned, and the surviving aircraft were scattered across makeshift airfields in southern Germany and Austria. The Luftwaffe that had once dominated European airspace had effectively ceased to exist. Yet one pilot had endured through it all. Erich Hartmann survived 5 years of nearly continuous aerial combat. By the end of the war, he had flown more than 1,400 combat missions and achieved 352 confirmed aerial victories. No fighter pilot in history had ever reached such a number, and it remains a record that has never been surpassed. His skill in the cockpit was undeniable. Fellow pilots described his flying as precise and disciplined, almost surgical in execution. Hartmann rarely wasted ammunition and avoided unnecessary risks. He believed that survival in aerial combat depended not on reckless aggression, but on patience and perfect timing. But even Hartmann understood that his personal achievements did not change the outcome of the war. The lesson he carried from those final months was far more sobering. World War II had demonstrated that modern warfare was no longer decided solely by bravery or individual talent. The pilots in the sky, no matter how skilled, were only one part of a much larger system. Aircraft required factories, pilots required training programs, and entire air forces depended on a constant flow of fuel, spare parts, and replacement crews. Once that system collapsed, even the most capable fighter pilot could do little to change the course of events. Germany had entered a war of attrition against enemies whose industrial capacity was several times greater than its own. The outcome of that contest had been written years before the final battles took place. In the end, the story of Erich Hartmann is not simply the story of the greatest fighter ace who ever lived. It is the story of a moment when individual excellence collided with the overwhelming force of industrial warfare. And in that collision, the fate of the Luftwaffe and the outcome of the war had already been decided. The battles in the sky may have ended long ago, but the lesson remains. In modern war, victory belongs not only to the brave, but to the nation that can endure the longest.